The American merchant marine was not forged in the crucible of war. It was born from the calculated urgent industrial policy of the late 1930s. Recognizing the nation's outdated transport capacity, the U.S. Maritime Commission initiated a massive nautical renaissance in 1936. The goal was to modernize the entire fleet. The need for speed was paramount, leading designers to adopt standardized freighter plans, including the C1, C2, and C3 classes. They also embraced revolutionary production methods. Chief among these innovations was the wholesale adoption of welding. This was a major change from the traditional, time-consuming process of riveting. Welding drastically accelerated construction, saving steel and labor. This foundation led to the EC2 design, the standardized utilitarian cargo ship that would soon become famous as the Liberty ship. These 441-foot vessels were later nicknamed the Ugly Ducklings of World War II. They were designed for rapid, mass production, capable of cruising at a steady, if modest, 11 knots. But while American shipyards were still laying keels, the global conflict began to close in. This transformed the merchant marine's vulnerable position into one of immediate peril. The escalating danger first became undeniable on October 9, 1939. The freighter, City of Flint, carrying a neutral cargo, was intercepted by a German warship. Captain Joseph Gaynard and his crew watched the massive vessel approach. Its large guns were chillingly trained on them, capable of blowing them to Kingdom Come in one blast. The American ship was ordered to halt. A German prize crew boarded the vessel, declaring Gaynard guilty of carrying contraband to the enemy. The capture of a neutral American ship on the high seas was an outrageous act of aggression. The City of Flint began an unwanted wandering, traveling to the Arctic ports of Tromsø and Murmansk. Its fate was sealed when a stealthy Norwegian boarding party apprehended the German crew, freeing the vessel and its indignant mariners. The gloves came off entirely on May 21, 1941, with the sinking of the Robin Moore. After a U-boat surfaced and interrogated the American freighter, its commander declared the ship carried contraband cargo of war supplies. Captain William Myers was given a mere 20 minutes to abandon ship. The unarmed vessel was sunk by a torpedo and deck gun shells. The 45 survivors, including 2-year-old Robin McCullough, endured 13 desperate days in open boats. They subsisted on hardtack. While the young boy amused himself by watching pretty fishes, the adults recognized the grim reality of the sharks circling beneath them. President Roosevelt reacted to the sinking with fury, strongly denouncing the act. This fueled the political will to abandon neutrality at sea. The attacks intensified throughout 1941. The Steel Seafarer was sunk in the Red Sea. The tanker I.C. White was torpedoed. The Lehigh was torpedoed without warning. Just days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Sagadahoc was torpedoed and sank in a terrifying 20 minutes. The civilian fleet was already in the fight. In response to these lethal attacks, the final transformation of the merchant marine began. On November 17, 1941, the arming of American merchant ships was officially authorized. This transformed the civilian mariners into frontline combat support personnel. The Merchant Marine Naval Armed Guard was established. This placed Navy gunners and officers aboard every freighter. These men, often commanding efficient 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns, were now serving in the forefront of battle. Secretary Knox would later assure a worried mother that these men were serving their country as much as any sailor on a battleship. This monumental industrial and defensive effort was symbolized on Liberty Fleet Day, September 27, 1941. At the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore, the first of the standardized EC2 vessels, the Patrick Henry, was launched. Mrs. Avinicode at the Any Border. Henry A. Wallace christened the ship as a band played the Star-Spangled Banner. The Patrick Henry represented the initial triumph of American industrial might. It was the first of 2,751 sister ships that would form the indispensable bridge of ships critical for supplying the Allies. The groundwork was complete. The ships were being built, the crews were sailing, and the guns were mounted. The United States had laid the foundation for the largest logistical effort in history. It was preparing its civilian mariners for a war that was already at their doorstep. They stood ready for the storm that would break just 10 weeks later. The German offensive, dubbed Operation Drumbeat, or Pokenschlag, began in January 1942. It immediately exposed a catastrophic, almost criminal failure of American coastal defense. The U.S. Navy, focused on the distant Pacific and unprepared for submarine warfare so close to its shores, had no adequate plan. It had no integrated resources. Most fatally, it had no immediate means to protect the vital supply line that ran just miles off the eastern seaboard. The result was the happy time for German U-boat commanders. This was a period of devastation that British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later criticised as a state of negligence bordering on incompetence. The losses were immediate and grievous. The East Coast and Caribbean waters quickly became known as U-boat lane, a submariner's paradise for German captains. The most shocking vulnerability was the American blackout failure. Coastal cities, ignoring the war at sea, burned brightly. Their illumination glowed like a spectre of death along the coast, perfectly silhouetting Allied ships for easy targeting. Regulations forcing the dimming of these city lights were not implemented until May 1942. This was long after the campaign had already wreaked havoc. This slaughter was defined by the U-boats' impunity and bold insolence, while the U.S. Navy issued communiques claiming strong measures and the liquidation of U-boats. This was largely a public relations fiction. It was designed to provide false assurance to the public. Meanwhile, the men at sea faced an uncontested carnival of destruction. The U-boat crews not only sank ships, but often lingered to exhibit calculated cruelty. During the sinking of the freighter Caribou, the U-boat shelled the vessel while lifeboats were being lowered. It torpedoed one of the lifeboats. It then surfaced to mock the survivors, asking if they were all right. The human experience was one of sudden, overwhelming terror. When the Lindenhall was torpedoed, the ship, carrying 4,000 tons of Brazilian iron ore, went down so quickly that the Lascar firemen refused to go on watch, terrified of the rapid sinking. Survival often depended on reflexes and sheer desperation. Oiler Pedro Prondo, knocked out of his bunk on the sinking Esparta, was swept into a ship's toilet during the explosion. He managed to fight his way out, determined not to die in that inglorious bastion. He then walked off the deck into the cold water. The casualty rates among the civilian mariners were staggering. In the first 6 months of the war, 383 Allied ships were lost in American waters. This crippled the logistical capacity and created a critical manpower shortage. The Merchant Marine had started the war with 55,000 mariners. It suddenly needed thousands more. To meet this immense demand, the Recruitment and Manning Organization, or RMO, was established in May 1942. It was tasked with drawing in novices, draft-deferred men, and old-timers, some in their 70s, to crew the rapidly expanding fleet. The tide began to turn, though painfully slowly. The implementation of coastal light dimming, a measure resisted by local authorities for months, finally took effect in May. More critically, Vice Admiral Adolphus Andrews pushed for the adoption of the convoy system. On May 14, 1942, the first partial coastal convoy was inaugurated. These escorted groups meant that Allied ships were no longer sitting ducks cruising alone against the silent predators. The change was delayed, costing hundreds of lives and tons of cargo, but it marked the necessary painful beginning of the end for the U-boat's happy time in American waters. The Battle of the Atlantic was Winston Churchill's dominating factor of the entire war. It was not a single campaign, but a continuous global struggle fought across vast, unforgiving oceans. While the U-boats were successfully driven from the American coastline by mid-1942, they shifted their strategy to crucial supply routes. These routes were where Allied defense remained thin or the environment was too brutal for consistent protection. One such route, the Murmansk Run, became a theater of high-stakes sacrifice. The Allies, driven by the necessity of providing vital Lend-Lease supplies to the collapsing Soviet front, sent convoys into the Arctic Circle. These were voyages defined by the constant threat of U-boats, German air power stationed in Norway, and the relentless, unforgiving elements. Merchant mariners endured the long darkness, the frigid spray, and the knowledge that exposure in the icy water meant almost certain death. The most catastrophic moment of this brutal period came in July 1942 with convoy PQ-17. It was laden with 250,000 tons of supplies, including locomotives and railroad cars, carried by ships like the Horace Bushnell. precious potash was aboard the Horace Grey. The convoy was a strategic prize. The Admiralty, paralyzed by the perceived threat of the massive German battleship, Tirpitz, hiding in a Norwegian fjord, issued the fateful immediate order, scatter. The command was received with despair and disbelief. Captains felt their naval escorts were deserting them and giving them away to the Germans. The tightly organized convoy, its ships now isolated targets in the open sea, was transformed into a day of massacre. Of the 33 merchant ships, 23 were sunk by U-boats and bombers. This resulted in the loss of over 100,000 tons of desperately needed cargo. During the ensuing chaos, there were moments of chilling, surreal, human interaction. Survivors from the British Empire Byron reported being approached by a surfaced U-boat. Its crew questioned them, offered provisions, and then left them to the mercy of the sea. The immense sacrifice was magnified by the critical role of the tankermen. These vessels, often described as man-made volcanoes, carried the lifeblood of the battle fray. They faced the unique horror of instant, total annihilation. The SS Astral, torpedoed in the Caribbean, was one of many that simply disintegrated. The U-boat skipper chillingly recorded in his log that there were no survivors. When the Connecticut was struck off Trinidad, the resulting explosion engulfed the vessel in a huge sheet of yellow flame. This made the ship flame like the fires of Vesuvius. Yet, the tankermen persisted, completing thousands of voyages. They delivered the nearly 65 million tons of fuel required to sustain the Allied war machine. Thousands of miles south, another type of threat materialized. The German commerce raider. These heavily armed surface vessels preyed on lone, vulnerable Allied ships. The epitome of merchant marine defiance in this theater was the legendary stand of the SS Stephen Hopkins. On September 27, 1942, the lightly armed Liberty ship encountered the heavily armed German raider Steyr and its support ship, the Tannenfels. This happened 8 days out of Cape Town. The Stephen Hopkins carried only one 4-inch gun. Captain Paul Buck immediately ordered battle stations, refusing to surrender to the overwhelming odds. The ensuing battle was a desperate, almost suicidal act of resistance. The Stephen Hopkins crew, firing until the magazine suffered a catastrophic blast, fought with such ferocity that they managed to sink the smaller German vessel. Though the Stephen Hopkins was ultimately lost, its final heroic fusillade forced the Steyr to seek rescue. This resulted in the raider's eventual scuttling. The surviving crew, including the wounded first mate Richard Wyoski, endured 31 days adrift. They navigated by a sliver of wood. The ship's fate was cemented as one of the great epics of the sea. These constant losses in the Arctic, the North Atlantic, and the vast South Atlantic could not continue. If the Allies hoped to launch a successful land war, the war at sea needed a technological and tactical revolution. That turning point arrived in the spring and summer of 1943. The Allies began aggressively deploying new weapons. These included the short-range escort carrier, or baby flattop, and long-range radar. The introduction of air cover, exemplified by the carrier Avenger assigned to convoy PQ-18, provided a massive morale boost to the merchant seamen. They felt they were no longer sitting ducks. Simultaneously, the development of radar capable of spotting surfaced U-boats at night neutralized the Wolfpack advantage. This was the U-boat's preferred hunting time. The shift was swift and decisive. In May 1943, U-boat losses soared to 43. This was a catastrophic rate that German Admiral Karl Donitz could not sustain. Forced to recognize that the North Atlantic had become too lethal for his submarines, Donitz reluctantly ordered the majority of his U-boats to retreat. The tenacious, brutal, protracted struggle for the lifeline was finally won. This secured the essential bridge of ships that would allow the Allies to launch the invasions that would ultimately win the war. The debt, as British Admiral of the fleet, Sir Andrew Cunningham later acknowledged, was one we can never repay. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic secured the deep-sea lifeline. However, the merchant marine immediately faced a new, confined, and intensely dangerous theatre, the Mediterranean. Known to sailors as the Narrow Sea, its proximity to Axis air bases made every voyage a high-risk gamble. This forced Allied logistics into a concentrated, brutal campaign. The struggle to keep the island fortress of Malta supplied showcased the immense, almost suicidal sacrifices required. Operations like Pedestal in August 1942 saw massive convoys attempt to ram supplies through a gauntlet of concentrated air power, U-boats, and E-boats. Only 5 of 14 merchant ships reached Malta. However, the cargo delivered, 32,000 tons, was enough to save the island. Crews fought continuously. Captain R. E. Barrera of the O. Henry reported successfully engaging dive bombers with his small-caliber guns, forcing one plane into the sea. The danger was not always visible. Even after the successful invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch cleared the way for the push into Italy. The retreating Axis forces left behind a legacy of destruction. The constant threat of mines was illustrated catastrophically on January 1, 1943. The Arthur Middleton, part of an 11-ship convoy, was violently blown apart, likely by a mine. This resulted in the immediate loss of the entire ship and crew save for 3 men clinging to a raft. Liberty ships formed the indispensable logistical backbone for the subsequent invasions of Sicily and Italy. They delivered troops and materiel under intense air attack at Salerno and the bloody beachhead of Anzio. But the greatest single logistical catastrophe in the Mediterranean was caused not by overwhelming enemy action, but by devastating strategic carelessness. On the night of December 2, 1943, the harbour at Bari, Italy, was crammed with 25 Allied vessels. This included 6 American Liberty ships discharging cargo for the British 8th Army. Command had failed to sound air raid sirens. Crucially, harbour lights remained criminally illuminated. The exposed, brightly lit port served as a perfect homing beacon for a squadron of veteran German Stuka dive bombers. The attack began with a faint sound that grew into a low, terrifying drumming. The confusion ended when flares dropped, bathing the harbour in a maddening brilliance. The Stukas, described as wild Valkyries riding the night, commenced a thundering crescendo of attack. The Samuel Tilden was instantly hit, erupting in a brilliant 4th of July-like burst of flame. On the John Bascom, Captain Heitman and Ensign K. Bessel fought back fiercely. The ship was struck by 3 bombs. In the flaming, screaming holocaust that followed, a blazing tanker vomited red balls of oil that poured across the sky like comets. The catastrophe was compounded when the Liberty ship John Harvey, carrying a secret and highly volatile cargo of mustard gas, exploded simultaneously with the John L. Motley. The resulting blast was cataclysmic. It lifted the Lyman Abbott out of the water and gave it a severe list. Amidst the chaos, the human cost was staggering. Captain Heitman of the John Bascom was seen carrying his dead first assistant, Ellen Nicholas, through the wreckage. Exhausted mess boys were forced to fill in as able seamen fighting to survive. By the time the German planes departed, 14 of the 25 ships in Bari were sunk or destroyed. This resulted in the loss of 38 bodies recovered and 150 men posted as missing. The chemical attack, initially misdiagnosed as burn wounds, made the treatment of survivors agonizingly difficult. This cemented the Bari disaster as a devastating, bloody but largely unknown battle of the war. The logistical focus shifted dramatically in 1944 to the cross-channel invasion. D-Day represented the single largest logistical undertaking in history. It was sustained entirely by the merchant marine. The English Channel was choked with over 4,000 vessels. Many of them were Liberty ships engaged in a continuous shuttle service. The scale of the operation demanded innovation and engineered sacrifice. To sustain the beachhead, the Allies constructed massive artificial harbours. The mulberries were built of concrete. The gooseberries, which served as breakwaters, were formed by deliberately scuttling 70 freighters. 25 of these were American. These ships, sacrificed for strategic advantage, became vital infrastructure. They proved their worth during the Great Storm of December 1944, which wrecked the mulberries but left the gooseberries intact. With the success of the landings, the next critical task was clearing the route to the deep-water port of Antwerp. This port had been captured by Allied ground forces in September. Accessing the port required clearing the Scheldt River. This was a dangerous, painstaking operation by minesweepers, who removed approximately 250 mines. It was a perilous, essential task. The threat of mines proved a greater hazard than shore guns. This was demonstrated when the H.G. Blasdell struck a mine leaving Southampton, causing casualties among troops in her holds. Once Antwerp was open, merchant crews faced a new, terrifying form of warfare: the German vengeance weapons. The V-1 flying bomb, or buzz bomb, was characterized by its persistent, terrifying engine hum and visible red flames. Crews in port lived in dread of the audible approach, followed by the spine-chilling silence that signaled imminent impact. Far worse was the V-2 missile. Soundless and uninterceptable, these 12-ton rockets plunged from the stratosphere at 2,000 miles per hour. A V-2 strike on October 12 in Antwerp killed 500 soldiers and civilians. For the men in the engine room, this new terror was profoundly psychological. An engineer aboard the Bayou Chico, while waiting to discharge cargo in Antwerp, felt the dread personally. Unlike a plane or a torpedo, the incoming V-2 offered no chance to fight back, no time to prepare. It was an invisible, soundless executioner. This was a final testament to the relentless, multifaceted danger endured by the merchant mariners who kept the lifeblood of the Allied war machine flowing until the very last days of the European conflict. The final, grueling phase of the war was fought across the immensity of the Pacific. This was a logistical challenge that dwarfed all previous campaigns. The Allied strategy of island hopping demanded a constant, prodigious flow of supplies. Ammunition, engineering equipment, fuel, and food had to be transported thousands of miles over an ocean that seemed limitless. The merchant marine was the indispensable pipeline. But the sheer scale bred inefficiency. Captains of Liberty and Victory ships, having successfully evaded U-boats for weeks across the open sea, often arrived at their destination only to face the maddening inertia of the supply chain. They would sit at anchor for weeks, sometimes months, waiting for orders to discharge their vital cargo. One captain recalled being forced to sail to another island without having unloaded a single barrel or bale. This was a testament to the wartime waste and bureaucratic bungling that saw essential supplies remain undischarged throughout the war. Meanwhile, the global threat persisted, even in theaters considered secondary. In the vastness of the Indian Ocean, convoys remained dangerously vulnerable, often sailing without adequate escort. German U-boats, shifted from the Atlantic, continued their relentless hunting. Vessels like the tanker Jacksonville, torpedoed off Ireland in August 1944, or the Losmar, lost in the distant Red Sea, were stark reminders. The war at sea had not localized. It was everywhere. The merchant mariners endured the monotonous isolation of the long haul. They knew that sudden, catastrophic death could strike at any moment from a submerged predator. As the Allied advance closed in on the Japanese home islands, the desperation of the defense reached a terrifying climax. The invasion of Okinawa in April 1945, Operation Iceberg, saw the introduction of the kamikaze, the divine wind, as a focused, organized strategy. The Japanese pilots, often young men seeking to ride to heaven on the divine wind, targeted the immense fleet of 1,300 Allied ships gathered to support the landing. For the merchant mariners, this was a new psychological horror. The enemy was not trying to sink the ship and escape. The enemy was trying to die on the deck. The merchant ships, laden with explosives and fuel, became magnetic targets. The gunners of the Naval Armed Guard and the merchant crew fought continuous, intense aerial combat. The Hobbs Victory, for instance, engaged 2 Zeros. Its gunners fired until one bomber was shot down less than 100 yards away. But the second Kamikaze, unstoppable, crashed into the ship. This resulted in a massive explosion that killed members of the gun crew instantly. On the Logan Victory, Captain Edson B. Cates was seriously wounded in the terrifying blast and resulting fire. He refused to leave until he was the last man to abandon the sinking vessel. The civilian ships, lacking the armor and speed of their naval counterparts, sustained major damage. Yet, their inherent industrial resilience often kept them afloat long enough to complete their mission. The T-2 tankers, with their honeycomb of tanks construction, frequently survived torpedo hits that tore 40-foot holes in their hulls. They often crawled slowly back to port under their own power. The constant peril persisted until the very last weeks of the war. While Europe had celebrated V-Day, the Battle of the Atlantic claimed one final, tragic American victim. On May 5, 1945, 3 days after the German surrender, the tanker Black Point was torpedoed 6 miles off the coast of Rhode Island by the U-853. The attack was a final act of defiance by a rogue U-boat commander. It sank the ship, and killed a dozen men. This included bosun mate second-class Lonnie Lloyd, who was blown overboard. It was a brutal, senseless casualty that underscored the ultimate persistence of the war at sea. By the time the final armistice was signed, the price paid by the merchant marine was staggering. Over 733 U.S. flag merchant ships were lost to enemy action. More than 6,000 merchant seamen perished. This was a higher rate of casualties than any branch of the military save the Marine Corps. These heroes in dungarees, wearing no uniforms and holding no official military status, were often overlooked. Their heroism was relegated to the vast cold silence of the ocean. Yet, their contribution was indispensable. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, attested that the success of the island campaigns and the ability to keep the fleet fueled and supplied depended entirely on these commercial ships. The merchant marine's legacy is not just one of industrial might. It is the 5,304 ships built, the 2,751 Liberty ships. It is a legacy of profound human sacrifice. They ensured that the critical bridge of ships remained open, allowing the Allied forces to deliver the decisive blow. Their memory rests with the restless rolling waves, whispering a requiem across the ocean deeps,